So there are a number of things that I tell pastors, and obviously I'm telling you so that you can pass the word to the pastors as well. Things that a person should be aware of when it comes to a terminally ill person. And maybe one of the things that we need to first define is, what is a terminal illness? Can you give me some examples? Excuse me, can you give me some examples of a terminal illness? Just name one. If you can unmute yourself and tell me one terminal illness that comes to mind.
Professor, I would say one that just stands out in front of us continually, it's cancer.
That's probably the one that comes to mind for most of us. And of course, cancer doesn't have to be terminal, but when we hear of someone that's dying of a terminal illness, we think of could be bone cancer, it could be pancreatic cancer, it could be so many different forms of cancer, including leukemia. Mm-hmm. So that's one that comes to mind. What other disease comes to mind as a terminal disease?
Cystic fibrosis.
Anybody? What about Alzheimer's? You know, we don't think of Alzheimer's sometimes as a terminal disease, but it is a terminal disease. Eventually, the person just stops eating, drinking, because they don't know how to do that. And so the body sort of wastes away until it just simply stops working. COPD, which has to do with pulmonary function, that's also a terminal illness. And so there are a number of terminal illnesses. Critic fibrosis and other lung conditions. Thank you. That's good to put in the chat. So all those are terminal illnesses that obviously it's called terminal because they will lead to a termination of life. But unfortunately, when we talk about terminal illness, people are so uncomfortable, so afraid in dealing with a person that has it, that often they are left sort of isolated, maybe even abandoned. So one of the first things when we talk about ministry to the terminally ill is what we call the ministry of presence. Be there. But I don't know what to say when I go visit someone who has a terminal disease. I don't know what to say. And so what I say to people is not so much what you say. Your very presence already makes a huge difference in their life. Listening to them makes a huge difference in their lives. When I visit my hospice patients, or when I visit members of my church or churches that were dying of a terminal illness, I listen more than I talk. Pastors have a tendency of want to bring encouragement and hope to a patient, which is obviously perfectly okay and expected. But what I say to pastors is, before you provide hope or encouragement or you cite Bible texts, Bible promises, start by listening to them and their stories. I remember as a hospice chaplain, I was visiting a patient of mine, and she said to me, "I like when you visit me. When my pastor comes, he wants to talk about the weather and sports and politics and the church and all those things. But when you come, you listen to me and my story." And so listening is probably one of the most valuable tools that you will use with someone who is dying of a terminal illness. Instead of wanting to cheer them up, give them encouragement and hope, which again has its place, we're going to talk about that in a little while. The first thing is to listen to their fears, listen to their concerns, listen to their sadness, listen to their anger, if that's the case. It's better to allow them to vent those things because people are not used to listening to them. And so that's a wonderful thing that you can do while you are with them. Listen to their loved ones. Maybe they don't want to say anything because they don't want to upset the person who's dying, their loved one who's dying. But sometimes they want to talk to you and tell you how frustrated they are, how tired they are. So listening is probably the best, most important skill that you can use when you are working with someone who is dying of a terminal disease. Empathize, don't proselytize. Of course, as a hospice chaplain, I work with people of all faiths and sometimes of no faith at all. So it's very important for me to understand who they are and their background and not try to convert them into my belief system. I want to know what they're going through and empathize with their experience, with their feelings, instead of simply telling them, well, you shouldn't feel this way. Let me tell you what the Bible says, but I'm working with someone who's not even a Christian. For me to say this is what the Bible says doesn't really ring any bells for them. So don't use the opportunity to proselytize. And again, as pastors, I tell them that we don't always work with church members. Sometimes it's relatives of church members who are not Christians, who are not Adventists. So don't use that as an opportunity to proselytize. Empathize is much more important. To friends, to relatives, to members of the church, I always tell them to offer practical help. You probably hear often people say things like, if you ever need me, give me a call. If there's anything that I can do for you, let me know. Well, that if it makes it very difficult for families or for patients to actually act on that. I know so-and-so said, if I ever need you, but what could I ask him to do? And I kind of feel uncomfortable asking him to do something for me. So instead of saying, if you ever need me, what if you offer practical help? For instance, this coming Tuesday afternoon, I have some time off. I'm going to come and mow the lawn, or I'm going to come clean the windows, or in fact, if you're visiting with them and you see the sink full of dishes, just get up and say, hey, I love washing dishes. Would you mind if I do it? So those are practical things that you can do. Can I shine your shoes? Can I dust? All those things. Remember that the loved one is ministering or taking care of their loved one who is dying of a terminal illness. Sometimes they don't even have time for themselves. So any practical help that you can offer would not only be appreciated and welcomed, it would be very, very helpful to the loved ones, who then can devote more of their time to minister to the person who is dying. Here's something that I have learned through the years working with hospice patients and hospice nurses, social workers. They will all tell you the same thing. By the way, the hospice movement got started in Europe, there in England. So I'm talking to those of you who have probably that knowledge of where hospice began. But one of the things that we have learned in working with patients is that somehow, I think it's subconscious. I don't think it's a conscious decision, but it seems like patients who are dying of a terminal illness seem to know when and maybe even how they're going to die. So very often when we work with terminally ill patients, we begin to watch for special events. For instance, it may be an anniversary coming up, a birthday coming up. It could be a holiday coming up. I've had patients that they seem to last longer than it was expected. And again, we begin to wonder, why is it that they're still hanging on? They don't seem to get better. They don't seem to get worse. They just sort of plateau. What could it be? So we talk to the family and ask them, when is your anniversary, your birthday? Because maybe they are waiting for that. I remember a patient of mine, he had breast cancer. And notice that I said he, not she, because men also have breast cancer. So he had breast cancer and was declining. And he died 2 days before his daughter's birthday. He chose, and I say that again, I believe he made that decision, but he chose not to die on her birthday so that she wouldn't remember her birthday every year, would be connected to his death. Of course, you might say, well, 2 days before, it's pretty close. Well, it's close, but it's not the same day. And it's interesting also that the night that he died, he was very restless, and his wife, who had been sleeping with him, decided to sleep on the sofa. And when she woke up next morning, he had died. So again, he didn't want her to be there with him when he died. So sometimes patients sort of make that decision when they will die and how they will die. Sometimes they wait for someone to come see them, to visit them. I haven't seen my brother in 2 years, and they keep hanging on and hanging on. And when we ask that question, someone said, well, they haven't seen their brother in 2 years. Well, can you contact them and see if they can come, or at the very least call them? Nowadays, FaceTime them. And it happens very often when they see that person that they finally are able to let go. Sometimes it's the opposite. They wait until they have no one with them. I was visiting a member of my church in Wisconsin one time, and as I was in the hospital, she was surrounded by all her kids, and she said to them, "Can I talk to the pastor? You guys go to the cafeteria." And so they left, went to the cafeteria, and while I was there, she died. She didn't want to die when her kids were present. So sometimes terminally ill patients make those decisions. Again, I think it's a subconscious decision, but they decide when they're going to die, how they're going to die. And so watch for special events, talk about who they need to see or who they need to forgive or be forgiven by. Those are ways to help the person who may be dying of a terminal illness. One common experience by some people is the fear of dying. And there's a difference between the fear of dying and the fear of death. I remember one of my patients, I was talking to him and I said, "Do you have any fears?" And he said, "Dying." And I said, "Just to be clear, do you have a fear of death or a fear of dying?" And he said, "No, I'm not afraid of death. I don't care what happens after that." He wasn't a Christian. He said, "I don't care what happens after death. It's over. I don't care. What I'm afraid of is the process of dying. I don't want to lose control over my body functions. I don't want to be in horrible pain." So we could then talk with the nurses about, and with the doctors about what to provide him so that he would be comfortable and not have that kind of pain or those kinds of concerns. So one of the questions that I ask very often of someone who is dying of a terminal illness is, do you have any fears? Do you have any concerns? Asking them that may facilitate their expression of whatever their fears may be. Of course, the ultimate goal is to help them die in peace. Again, hospice is not about dying. Hospice is about living. We want to provide the patient with the comfort, with the peace that they need until life is no more. I know, especially as a chaplain, that people would say, "Oh, you're a hospice chaplain. That's kind of like the angel of death." But once they get to know what it is that we do in hospice, including the chaplain of the hospice that I would work with, they understand, oh, we're all here to help, your loved one continue to live and for you to enjoy life with them until death takes them or until life is no more. So we want to help them die in peace. So let's talk briefly about death and dying. Back in the 1960s, I believe, there was a Swiss-American psychiatrist by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I think she's probably known everywhere in the world. She noticed that with the people that she was working with, they seemed to have similar reactions to their experience, and so they came to be known as the stages of dying. And you probably have heard about them, the denial, one of the first one, denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And they were accepted for a long time, but then those that work with people who were dying noticed that they don't really happen that way. Number one, people have different experiences more than just those five. So if you were to put the I almost said Ellen White. See, we're so used to quoting Ellen White that I almost quoted her without when she didn't say that. What Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, if you put that the 5 stages of grief in a diagram, it might look sort of like that. But again, I wish that grief, I wish that terminal illness was that nice and clean, so that you could say, well, right now I'm in denial and I know the next stage is anger and the next one is bargaining, but I know I'm going toward acceptance. I wish it was that nice and clean, but it's not. In fact, someone said it's more like this, maybe, where you have an experience of maybe denial and then highly emotional experience of anger and maybe fear, bargaining, hope, and anxiety. But even if you put it this way, you're still sort of moving in the direction of acceptance. So a better picture of the experience of someone who is dying and their loved ones might be more like this, where you have denial, but then you move to acceptance. And then you go back to anxiety, and maybe you have some hope, and then back to acceptance, and back to denial, and up to anger, and down to depression. It's very different for every person. And only the person going through that experience can dictate or can go through that experience. We can't tell someone, well, because you're here, the next step will be this next step. What that means to us is that when we visit someone and they may be going through, say, a period of fear, again, we don't just tell them, well, just hang in there. Maybe if you talk to God and offer, to serve him if he heals you or something like that, those do some sort of bargaining, then you'll move in the direction of acceptance. You shouldn't suggest that, because only the person can make that decision. And by the way, instead of calling them stages, it may be better to call them experiences. So these are the experiences that people go through, not necessarily stages that they go through. They may experience hope, guilt, sometimes 2 at the same time, sometimes 1 and then go back to another one and then go to a different one and then go back to the one that they have gone through again. Those are experiences that people go through. Some people have painted it different ways, like the different feelings in some sort of like a bingo ball machine of sorts, or a better way to call it by Norman Wright, who called this the tangled ball of emotions, dealing with grief and obviously again with terminal illness. So instead of talking about stages again, talk about experiences. It could be anxiety, confusion, panic, and you see the different. There are these and maybe others that are not even listed there, but they are all experiences, and they come and go, and then they go again, and they come again. Every person is different. Every family, every loved one is different. Something that might help us more is to talk about the tasks of the dying. And there are different lists. I just have this particular one of some of the tasks of the dying. And one of those tasks that some people who are in the process of dying have is to ask for forgiveness. We have seen that in some patients who, again, seem to be troubled, seem to be in discomfort, seem to be concerned, seem to be lingering much longer than maybe it would be expected, and come to find out maybe they did something or have something in their past for which they need to ask forgiveness. So that may be one of the things that, again, you can help someone who might be dying by asking him, is there something that you need to ask forgiveness for? And in the same token, maybe to offer forgiveness. Maybe someone hurt the person, the patient, and they have this resentment, this anger, this bitterness, that may be better to release that anger, resentment, hatred, whatever it may be, and offer forgiveness to whoever hurt them so that they can finally let go. It's almost as if that's keeping them anchored to life, even as the body needs to let go. The third task of the dying is to offer heartfelt thanks. And that could be as simple as telling the spouse, thank you for being a good wife, or thank you for, to the children, thank you for doing as well, and for, giving me so much excuse me, so much joy and, whatever it is, to offer heartfelt thanks. Could be to the church, to someone important in the church, someone that guided me to the faith, and I just want to express that thanks. To offer sentiments of love, and usually that obviously happens to the family. Some terminally ill patients do that in the form of letters. Sometimes they do it nowadays with video. They could do it in video. They could do it with their children and grandchildren, where they record messages to their unborn grandchildren or yet to be born grandchildren to say, I'm sorry that I haven't met you. You're not even born, but one day I hope that you can see me and know what I was like, etc. So they express love, etc. And task number 5 is to say goodbye. There's a point at which they want to say, yes, I am dying and I'm ready to die. And by the way, there's also something that we do in hospice that we found to be very useful, and is to teach families to let go of their loved ones, to give them permission to die. When my mother was dying, she got to see all of us children. I was the last one in the hospital there, and I was able to anoint her, to pray with her. She was not really communicating much at that point in time anymore. But I said to her, you can rest. If you want to rest, if this is the time for you to rest, you can rest. We will be together again. You know that when Jesus comes, we'll be together as a family. I'll take care of the others. Don't worry about them. I'll be there to take care of them. But if you feel that it's a time for you to rest, for you to die, you can do that. And then I said, I remember I was a Wednesday night, and I said, but I'll be here tomorrow. It would have been Thursday. Well, she passed away on Thursday morning at 5 a.m. before I made it to the hospital. So again, my mom was one of those that she didn't want to be with her kids when she died, but I was able to help her by granting her that permission. What happens very often is we gather around our loved one and we do the opposite. Don't leave me, I can't live without you. And what we're doing is hanging on to them when they're needing to let go. So that's why it's important to be able to say goodbye and to release them to live, to let go of life, if you want to say it that way. There is a difference between palliative and hospice care. Palliative care can still, a patient who's under palliative care can still receive curative measure. They can still receive treatments to help them overcome the disease. Palliative means to be comfortable. So they can still have comfort while at the same time receiving treatment to cure them. In hospice care, they can be kept comfortable, but not receive any kind of treatment to try to cure them. That's why they're terminal. And so therefore, we're just allowing the body or life to run its course, but hospice will do the very best to keep them comfortable in that process. For hospice care, at least here in the US anyways, the requirement to be in hospice care is that 2 physicians have to declare that you have 6 months or less to live. Now, some patients have gone beyond the 6 months. What happens after the 6 months is that they have to be recertified for another 6 months. I had a lung patient in one of my, in hospice anyways, who lasted 2 years. So he went through 4 recertifications, or actually 1 certification and 3 recertifications. So hospice again is for those who have 6 months or less to live, and they just want to be kept comfortable. The hospice team will do everything to provide that comfort so that they can have quality time with the family. Palliative care, they will provide not only comfort, but also treatments to cure them from whatever disease they may be going through. Just keeping an eye on the clock to make sure that I cover as much as I can. Okay, I'm going to skip this portion. And you know what I can do is, Rainer, I'll be happy to send you the PowerPoint and you can share it with everyone in the team too. So the things that I'm not covering, then I'll be happy to send you that for you to share. So the loved ones also experience a separation of sorts. Little by little, they're losing their loved one. In fact, one of the experiences that many loved ones go through is what we called anticipatory grief. They grieve little by little the loss of their loved one. And often what happens when the person actually dies, because they've already been doing the grief for this long time, they don't seem to be grieving. And you might have seen people at a funeral where they don't seem to be crying. They don't seem to be too upset. Maybe they didn't love their husband or their wife or their mom or whatever it was. No, it's not that they didn't love them. It's that they've already been doing the work of grieving way before the person actually died. So that's why it's called anticipatory grief. The grief was anticipated. Now they may still have some grief afterwards, but maybe in a lesser degree. So that's one of the experiences that loved ones sometimes go through. There's also an experience that we've noticed in terminally ill, and this is important, especially for those of us who are Seventh-day Adventists. It is not uncommon for a person who is dying to see someone who has already died. Visiting a patient who would say something like, Uncle John came to see me yesterday, and of course the family says, Dad has lost his mind because Uncle John died 10 years ago. How could he see him yesterday? We as Seventh-day Adventists know that dead know not anything, so it's not the spirit of Uncle John that came back to see him or anything like that. But somehow in the mind of a terminally ill patient, they seem to see people who have gone before them. And so it's almost like a sign that they're giving you that they're preparing to die. So what we tell families is, instead of saying, you're crazy, Uncle John died, he's lost his mind, it's a hallucination or something like that, maybe to encourage that type of conversation by saying something like, really, what did he say? Again, you might think, that's crazy, but you are facilitating that expression. It's possible that they may say something like, well, Uncle John says that it's time for me to go. Again, they may give you that kind of a message. Something else that they often do is to talk about taking a journey or taking a trip or going someplace. I went to see a patient in the last hospice where I was, and when I walked into the room, the nephew was there, and it was my first visit to visit with them. And the nephew says, Uncle Mike says that he wants to go to the store. And, I keep telling him he doesn't need to go to the store. And so I try to explain to him, I think he's trying to tell you that he's getting ready to die. And sure enough, that night he passed away. So if they talk about getting their suitcase ready, getting the tickets, they need the map, those kinds of things, it could well be that they're saying, I'm getting ready to die. So those are the things that, again, if you listen, it will help you to stay attuned to what may be happening soon. And I want to finish with this, bringing hope in the midst of hopelessness, because again, it doesn't mean that we simply listen and let them talk, or we just simply ask questions, but it is possible to offer them hope. The question is, what kind of hope? So I want to share with you, I'm just going to my notes here to make sure, yeah. So someone said that there are 5 stages of hope. First stage is the hope for a cure. When you get the news you have cancer, well, we don't want to just say, oh, okay, I guess I'll just simply die. No, the first question is, well, can we do something about it? And is there any other medication we can try? Is there any other treatment that we can try? So the first is hope for a cure. When that doesn't seem to be working, or even if it seems to be working, the next hope is for treatment. Is there any other treatment that we can try? Is there an experimental treatment maybe that we haven't been told or we haven't heard about? The third hope is for a prolongation of life. Is there something we can do to help me live just a little longer? My son is graduating from high school in 2 months. Is it possible? Is there something we can do so that I can be alive for his graduation? So I'm hoping that that I can live just long enough. I'm okay. I know I'm going to die. I just want to live just a little longer, long enough for that experience. The fourth hope is the hope of the dying, and it's more like, I hope that I don't die in pain. I hope that I have a peaceful death. I hope to be surrounded by my loved ones. I hope I can see, something happen. So it's the hope of what could happen in that process of dying. And the last hope for most people is that the hope of a peaceful death. Well, what about miracles? Don't miracles happen? Of course they do happen. Maybe we have seen some miracles. There's a doctor who, when in talking to his patients, a Christian doctor, who would say something like, I wish you could be the one who receives a miracle. I believe in God who can perform miracles, but I know you would want me to be completely honest with you. He says, and the truth is, I have never seen anyone with your disease recover at this stage. So I hope you do receive a miracle. I would love to see one. And I pray that God in his mercy grants you one, but in my experience, they're pretty rare. Well, he can say that as a doctor. Me as a pastor or as a chaplain, I can't say that. But what I can say is, I don't know what's going to happen. And yes, God could perform a miracle. But if he doesn't, where are you in this stage of life? Or where are you in the relationship to him? Or where are you in relationship to upcoming death? So that, again, it's not denying their hope, but more like changing the focus of their concern. So I think that's about all that I want to cover here. One last thing. I don't know if you guys have access to Netflix. I know sometimes in some countries they do, in some countries they don't. Netflix has two very, very good movies. One is called Extremists, which is about people who are dying in hospital. And one that I show when I train pastors is called Endgame, and they follow one person in the last few weeks of her life. And it's interesting to see some of the things that I talked about. Excuse me. Some of the things that I talked about, you can see in her own experience, the whole issue of fear, denial, sadness, joy, all of those emotions happening at different times. Amazon Prime has also a couple of good movies, What to Do When Someone Dies, and a few things about cancer. And if you're interested, obviously this was a very quick overview, but this is the book that we wrote. It's called Helping Write the Final Chapter. I think it's supposed to be on Amazon Digital sometime soon. I think it may already be in printed form, excuse me, but I believe it's also supposed to be in digital format sometime in the near future. It's printed by Advent Source, which is one of our printing presses here in the North American division.